The recruitment officer's letter sat open on my mother-in-law's kitchen table, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely read the date printed at the top. March 2019. I had 6 weeks left before my mandatory service call-up, unless I could prove an exemption. My mother-in-law slid a second piece of paper across the table toward me, a clinic appointment for a fertility consultation, and said, without a flicker of hesitation, "Get pregnant, Selam, and none of this matters anymore. It's the only door still open to you." I stared at both documents for a long moment. Then I did something none of them, not my husband, not his mother, not even I myself fully understood I was capable of, until the moment I actually did it. Part 1. Life under the Proclamation. My name is Selam, and I was 24 years old in the spring of 2019, living in Asmara, Eritrea, under a system of indefinite national service that had shaped nearly every major decision of my adult life, the way it shaped the lives of an entire generation of Eritreans who came of age under Proclamation 821995, the law establishing mandatory national service for men and women alike, originally framed as an 18-month commitment, but in practice extended indefinitely for many conscripts across the decades following its introduction. I had completed an initial round of service myself at 19, spending 14 months at a training and assignment center before being released back into civilian life through a combination of luck, a family connection, and what I understood at the time to be a permanent exemption tied to my subsequent marriage. I married my husband, Jonas, in 2017 at 22 in a ceremony that our families had arranged with considerable care, partly for genuinely warm reasons. Jonas and I had known each other since childhood, and our families had long hoped we might eventually marry, but partly, as I would come to understand more fully 2 years later, because marriage itself was widely understood, at least informally, to reduce a woman's likelihood of being called back into active service, particularly if that marriage produced children relatively quickly. For the first 2 years of our marriage, this informal understanding remained just that informal background, something everyone assumed rather than something anyone directly enforced. Jonas and I had discussed starting a family, in the ordinary way young married couples do, without any particular urgency, focused instead on building our small household, with Jonas working as a mechanic and me managing a modest tailoring business I'd built out of skills my own mother had taught me. That changed in February 2019, when I received the letter informing me that, due to a broader government review of service exemptions and a renewed push to address personnel shortages, my previous release had been reclassified, and I was now required to report for an active service assessment within 6 weeks, with actual reassignment likely to follow shortly after. Part 2. My mother-in-law's solution. I brought the letter to Jonas first, and his reaction, a mixture of genuine alarm and a kind of resigned, weary familiarity with a system that had disrupted countless families around us over the years, matched my own. But it was his mother, Olmaz, who moved fastest to identify what she considered the obvious, urgent solution. Olmaz had lived through decades of this system, had watched 2 of her own sisters called into extended service during the war years, and had developed, over that time, a hard, practical understanding of exactly which loopholes and exemptions the system still recognized, and which ones had quietly closed over the years. Pregnancy, she explained to me over that same kitchen table conversation, remained one of the few reliably respected grounds for exemption or deferral, not a permanent guarantee, but a documented, generally honored basis for delaying or avoiding call-up, particularly in the early months of pregnancy when service would pose genuine physical risk. "You have 6 weeks," Olmaz told me, with the particular brisk efficiency she brought to every family crisis. "If you're visibly, verifiably pregnant before your assessment date, they will defer you. I've seen it work for others. It's not guaranteed forever, but it buys you real time, and real time is what we actually need right now." I want to be honest about how genuinely reasonable this suggestion felt in that specific moment, surrounded by real fear and real-time pressure. Jonas and I had discussed having children eventually anyway. This simply meant moving that timeline forward under duress rather than at our own unhurried pace. Olmaz scheduled the fertility consultation, before I'd even fully agreed to the plan, treating my compliance as a foregone conclusion rather than a choice still genuinely mine to make. Part 3. The appointment. I attended the fertility consultation Olmaz had scheduled at a private clinic in central Asmara, still turning the entire situation over in my mind, uncertain, in a way I hadn't yet found words to fully articulate even to myself, about the growing sense that something about this specific solution, reduce a woman to fertility mechanism to solve a government bureaucracy problem, sat uneasily alongside the more straightforward, practical urgency everyone around me kept emphasizing. The doctor, a calm, efficient woman named Dr. Fesaha, reviewed my medical history, discussed the practical timeline involved, and then, almost as an aside, mentioned something that stopped me completely. "I should tell you," she said, glancing at the specific date printed on my recruitment letter, which I'd brought along at Olmaz's insistence to help establish the relevant timeline, "that under the most recent guidance we've been given regarding exemption assessments, women who have already completed one prior full term of service, as your file indicates you have, and who have been married for more than 18 months, as you also have, generally qualify for an administrative exemption on those grounds alone, separate entirely from any pregnancy-related deferral. Has anyone reviewed your file directly with the assessment office to confirm your actual current exemption status?" I sat in that small examination room, feeling something shift and reorganize inside me. "No," I said slowly, "no one has told me that. My mother-in-law said pregnancy was the only option available to me." Part 4. What I found when I actually checked. I left that appointment, and rather than returning home to report what the doctor had told me, went directly to the regional assessment office myself, a decision that surprised even me, given how thoroughly, over the preceding weeks, I had allowed Olmaz's confident framing of the situation to substitute for my own direct investigation. The administrative process at the assessment office was slow, bureaucratic, and occasionally frustrating in the particular way government offices often are. But after nearly 4 hours of waiting and explaining my situation to 2 different officials, I finally received written confirmation of exactly what Dr. Fesaha had suggested. Based on my completed prior service term and my marriage duration, I qualified for an administrative exemption from the current call-up entirely, a status that required only proper documentation submission, not pregnancy, not any medical intervention, nothing beyond paperwork I could have submitted weeks earlier had anyone bothered to actually check. I sat in the assessment office parking lot afterward, holding that exemption confirmation, feeling a complicated wave of relief crash directly into a much sharper, more uncomfortable question. Why had Olmaz been so certain, so immediately confident, that pregnancy was the only available path, when a simple administrative inquiry, one she, with decades of experience navigating this exact system, could easily have made herself, would have revealed an entirely different, considerably less invasive solution? Part 5. The unthinkable thing I did. I want to explain now what the unthinkable in this story's title actually refers to, because I suspect it's not what many people might initially assume, given how the setup unfolds. I did not get pregnant under pressure, despite the appointment Olmaz had scheduled and despite the very real fear that had made her suggestion feel, for several days, like the only reasonable path forward. That was the ordinary, expected outcome the entire situation seemed to be building toward, and it's not what happened. Instead, I went home that evening, sat Jonas and Olmaz down together, and told them directly, calmly, exactly what I had discovered, that I had already qualified for an administrative exemption weeks before Olmaz ever mentioned pregnancy as a solution, and that I intended to submit that exemption paperwork the following morning rather than proceed with anything related to the fertility consultation. Olmaz's reaction to this was where the situation became genuinely complicated, in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. Rather than relief that a simpler solution existed, she reacted with something closer to frustration, even anger, insisting that administrative exemptions were unreliable, subject to being overturned or challenged, and that pregnancy remained, in her experience, the only truly secure path. It was in pushing back against that specific insistence, asking her directly why she seemed more committed to the pregnancy solution than to the simpler, already confirmed exemption I had personally verified, that the actual underlying motivation finally, uncomfortably surfaced. "You and Jonas have been married for 2 years," Olma said finally, her composure cracking in a way I'd rarely witnessed from her. "I want a grandchild, Selam. I've wanted one since the wedding. When this letter arrived, I saw an opportunity to finally make that happen, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise now that you've found some paperwork loophole that lets you keep putting it off indefinitely." Part 6. What this revealed. I sat with that admission for a long moment, feeling the entire preceding weeks reorganize themselves into a considerably clearer, more troubling shape. Olmaz's urgent, confident push toward pregnancy had never really been primarily about the recruitment letter at all. The letter had simply provided a uniquely powerful, difficult-to-refuse pretext for pressuring me toward a decision she had already wanted to make on my behalf for reasons entirely her own. I confronted this directly, with Jonas present, in a conversation that became, in its own way, considerably more significant than the recruitment crisis that had originally triggered it. "Olmaz," I said, "I understand wanting a grandchild. That's a completely understandable thing to want, but using a genuine, frightening legal threat as leverage to push me toward a decision I hadn't actually chosen to make yet, that's a different thing entirely. That's not concern for my safety. That's using my fear to get something you wanted for yourself." Jonas, to his credit, backed me clearly in this conversation, telling his mother directly that decisions about our family's timeline belonged to the two of us, not to her, regardless of what pretext might arise to justify accelerating them. Part 7. The actual unthinkable decision. Here is the specific, unthinkable thing I actually did several weeks after this confrontation, once the immediate crisis had settled and my administrative exemption had been formally, successfully processed. I decided, after long consideration and considerable discussion with Jonas, that rather than simply accepting the exemption and returning to ordinary civilian life, I would voluntarily reapply for a specialized administrative role within the national service system itself, a position considerably less physically demanding than frontline assignment, working within the same bureaucratic exemption processing office that had, weeks earlier, taken me nearly 4 hours of persistent effort to get a straight answer from. This decision surprised nearly everyone around me, including, for a while, myself. Having just secured an exemption from service, choosing to voluntarily re-enter the system, even in an administrative capacity, seemed, to most people I explained it to, genuinely difficult to understand. But I had spent those difficult weeks watching how easily the system's genuine complexity and opacity had been used by Olmaz, even if not maliciously in her own understanding of her actions, as leverage against me, precisely because I hadn't had clear, accessible information about my own actual legal standing. I thought about how many other women, facing similarly frightening call-up letters, might be receiving similarly confident, similarly incorrect guidance from well-meaning family members who, like Olmaz, had genuine experience with the system but incomplete or outdated understanding of its current specific provisions. I applied for the administrative role specifically to work within the exemption processing office, motivated by a conviction that had crystallized clearly during those difficult weeks. That clear, accurate information, delivered directly rather than filtered through family pressure and assumption, was itself a form of protection that too many women in my position lacked access to. Epilogue. I've worked in that administrative role for over 5 years now, processing exemption applications for women facing exactly the kind of frightening, time-pressured call-up letters that once sent me into a fertility clinic waiting room under pressure I hadn't fully chosen for myself. I make a specific point, in every case I process, of ensuring the woman in front of me understands her actual full range of legal options, not just the option her family may have already decided was the only path forward, but everything the system genuinely allows. Jonas and I did eventually have a child together. Our daughter, born in 2021, conceived on our own timeline, entirely disconnected from any recruitment letter or administrative deadline. A decision that felt, when we finally made it, genuinely, fully ours in a way the earlier pressured timeline never would have. My relationship with Olmaz took considerably longer to repair than the immediate crisis itself. She struggled, for a long while, to fully accept that her actions, however rooted in genuine desire to protect me from a frightening bureaucratic threat, had also represented a real, troubling overreach into a decision that was never actually hers to make. We have gradually, over the years since, rebuilt something more honest between us. She has, eventually, acknowledged directly what she did, and I have, in turn, tried to understand the genuine fear and history that shaped her instinct to reach for the most immediately available solution rather than the more accurate one. I think often about how close I came to making an enormous, permanent decision about my own body and my own family's timeline based on incomplete, frightened information, delivered with total confidence by someone who genuinely believed she was helping. I think about how differently things might have unfolded if Dr. Fesaha hadn't happened to mention, almost as an aside, information that changed everything. The unthinkable thing I did, in the end, wasn't complying with pressure under fear. It was refusing to let fear make the decision for me, and then choosing, deliberately, to spend the years since making sure other women facing that same specific fear have better information than I initially did, before they're asked to make a decision about their own bodies that was never actually theirs to be pressured into in the first place. The end.